Late last year, two news organizations funded by the Russian government, RT and Sputnik, were forced to register as foreign agents in the United States at the insistence of the Department of Justice in Washington. The DOJ's orders were issued following claims by U.S. intelligence agencies that the two outlets were part of the Kremlin's alleged interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. And American lawmakers have since threatened other foreign-funded broadcasters, including this one, Al Jazeera, with similar measures. But what about the flip side of that? Namely, the U.S. government's own state-funded media operations that broadcast to 100 countries in more than 60 languages. Those stations include Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which have been lauded in some quarters for providing reliable reporting in countries with limited press freedom. However, like RT and Sputnik, they've also been accused of producing propaganda dressed up as news at the service of their sponsors in the State Department. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on U.S. state-funded media overseas and the at times muddy waters through which journalism and propaganda flow.
An American intelligence report finds that one of the weapons in the Kremlin's arsenal was its state-run news network, RT.
A congressional committee in the U.S. has just revoked RT America's accreditation on Capitol Hill.
Since RT and Sputnik News were forced to register as foreign agents back in November 2017, U.S. officials have threatened other government-funded broadcasters, like CGTN and Al Jazeera, with the same treatment. But the U.S. government itself is no stranger to broadcasting into other countries. Its foreign media budget stands at $685 million, dwarfing the $450 million parceled out to domestic public broadcasters. The foreign media operation is run through the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the BBG, which houses 5 broadcasting centers under its umbrella. The Office of Cuba Broadcasting, based in Miami, is home to Radio and TV Marti. There's also Radio Free Asia, which covers the socialist and communist countries of Southeast Asia, and the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, including 24/7 Arabic language TV network Al Hurra. But the BBG's flagship stations are without doubt Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. As is the case with RT, whether their output is journalism or propaganda depends on who you ask.
If you look at what RFERL is broadcasting, it is news, it's information, it's moderate in tone, it's not propagandistic, it may have a stance, but the kinds of coverage really aren't that much different than you would find in the Washington Post or the New York Times or other major independent media.
The kind of cozy relationship that eventually emerged between Voice of America or Radio Free Europe and the propaganda machinery, whether it's the U.S. State Department or CIA, is not cozy, it's just like employees. These are state-run.
Accurate reporting, reliable reporting, balanced reporting.
The budget comes from the government. There is no independence. Yes, news is being communicated, but in a way with a selected constellation of news that pushes forward a very particular line of understanding the world.
One of the questions that has arisen involving VOA and other broadcasters in recent years has been, are you simply providing journalism to those people? Or are you trying to agitate and fan the flames of resistance in any target country you're broadcasting to?
We shall speak to you about America and the war. The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth.
Voice of America was started during World War II by the Office of War Information as a vehicle to counter Nazi propaganda.
Today, Europe also hears a new and forthright attack on Moscow from the transmitters of Radio Free Europe, a privately sponsored American organization which assails communism with no holds barred.
Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty began life during the early years of the Cold War as an opposition broadcasting station to the communist world. Their claim that they were privately sponsored was in fact a cover story. In truth, they were the product of CIA psychological warfare operations, and the agency continued to provide their funding and even senior staff until the early 1970s.
During the Cold War, we saw in different parts of Europe, there was the same kind of lack of information as people were, stuck behind what we called then the Iron Curtain. And we didn't know at that point who was listening. And we just kept sending this news and information about what was really going on in the world, what the outside world was like.
Messages of peace and goodwill are to be relayed to those who've had enough of red propaganda.
And it was only after the wall came down that we began to hear from people and how important that lifeline of news and information was for them.
When these countries got their independence, their leaders and their freedom fighters, if you will, gave great credit to VOA and Radio Free Europe. When you look back at the broad history of the Cold War, RFE and RL played an important role. Part of it was news, but part of it was clearly propaganda.
Sometimes that propaganda took these Cold Warriors well beyond the traditional remit of journalists. In the 1960s, veteran CBS journalist Edward R. Murrow was appointed director of the United States Information Agency, or USIA, the body within the State Department that oversaw Voice of America. Murrow was drafted in to boost the agency's prestige. In practice, he did more than that. This memo from Murrow to the CIA director of the time offered the support of the USIA's Cuba broadcasters to aid the CIA in its efforts to overthrow the Castro government. Broadcast could urge Cubans, Murrow said, to engage in relatively safe forms of sabotage. If real results were achieved, he continued, the Voice of America could report these as evidence of opposition to the Castro regime through interviews with refugees and extracts from letters. The 1970s saw efforts to create more distance between the government and its broadcasters. In 1971, the CIA's funding of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was revealed and swiftly terminated. 5 years later, a law creating Voice of America's current charter was passed, including a barrier, a kind of firewall, intended to prevent government interference.
The firewall is often trotted out as an example of the shield that enables VOA to do independent, unfettered journalistic work. But the more intelligent and more informed journalists at VOA were always aware that there was pressure being imposed down the line, and that pressure could always end up on the desk of a specific writer or correspondent.
This close relationship between US foreign policy and US foreign-funded media continues to attract criticism today. US policy towards Iran has vacillated between suspicion and threats of regime change. The US government's budget for broadcasting in Iran, shared between Voice of America's Persian service and Radio Fada, an offshoot of Radio Free Europe, is estimated at more than $30 million per year.
The fundamental mission of venues like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe is to pick and choose certain events that have actually happened and package it in a way that dovetails with the regime change narrative. For example, late last year we had a series of labor-related demonstrations in Iran, people demanding living wages and so forth. They pick particularly on certain kinds of slogans that say, if not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, this regime will fall.
این اعتراضا رو کی باعث شده؟ حکومت باعث شده مردم زندگیشون رو ول کنن بیان تو خیابون. کسی که امروز اومد بیرون فردا میاد بیرون.
We covered both sides of the issue. We covered what the protesters were saying. We covered what the government of Iran was saying about the protesters. We covered what the U.S. government was saying. And what we discovered is, even though in Iran it's against the law to access our content, we found the views of our content go like this before the protest, and then all of a sudden it went like that.
It is undeniable that US foreign-funded media do provide some public interest journalism in countries with limited press freedom, often at considerable risk to their journalists. Nonetheless, few would deny their status as instruments of soft power. From the 1940s until the end of the Cold War, the US, along with Britain's BBC, enjoyed hegemony in state-funded foreign broadcasting. But as hard power has begun to shift, and new players rise in an emerging multipolar world, they too have started to broadcast their perspectives to other parts of the globe. This is something that Washington has found difficult to accept. By attacking alleged Russian propaganda, the US fired a shot in a new cold information war.
Well, US authorities wanted a media war, and Russia's giving it right back to them.
So what that means is that the US government-funded outlets like Voice of America will probably have to register in Russia as foreign agents.
A shot that may well have ended up, inadvertently, jeopardizing their own state-funded media operation.